I'm just going to jump in and invite my co-authors to come right in. But I want to say that this piece, it really started back in 2012 when Raven, Sakina, and I were graduate students in Django Paris's class. And what was happening in the world at that time was Trayvon Martin, which I'm sure you all know who Trayvon Martin is. If not, you can look him up. But Trayvon Martin was killed at that time. And for Raven and I in particular, we were working on a group project for Django Paris's class. And we really felt the need to not move on with, the class was around social justice, but we really felt compelled to bring what was happening in the world into the classroom at that time and have a discussion around critical literacies and the kind of work we were talking about with youth into that space. And so a lot of the things that, some of the practices we share is something that Raven and I, started out with creating for our graduate course. And it consisted of teacher educators and thinking about how do we take up what's happening in the world, specifically around racial violence, and bringing it to a space. And how should teachers who are working with youth, particularly youth of color, how can they take these issues up and work with the youth? And so it started there. And, but this particular article, it came out of a special issue that me and two of my other colleagues, Lamar Johnson and Tamara Butler, did. And the title of it was From Racial Violence to Racial Justice. And we were trying to think about what are the practices, that we take up with issues around racial violence. So it's part of a larger special issue that we did with many great pieces included in that special issue that focuses on racial violence in the world and what should we be doing as English educators and English teacher educators around this topic. So this is just one of many of the pieces, but I would say that's how it started from me.
Yeah, and I'll add to what Dr. Baker Bell just said. It definitely began by us having conversations as a result of being in Dr. Paris's class, and particularly for April and I, we carpooled together every week to go to class. So we were always having these conversations, in addition to Sakina, because we all had the class together. So, we understood that then, actually Trayvon Martin was murdered on February 26th, which was this past week, 6 years ago. So we felt the need and just the rites of passage, just to understand that we can't all the time go on with business as usual as teachers. We have to sometimes stop and sort of give due and justice and time and space to invite others to share their feelings and emotions about the massacre of Black and brown bodies, as well as other injustices that have been happening around Black and brown bodies. So it definitely began there. And I'm just excited to see that it has catapulted into this, which leads us to where we are today. And so I'm just excited and proud of what we've been able to do to push our thinking and to know that, we've grown definitely within 6 years.
Yeah, I just want to add a few words. In the spirit of taking time to, acknowledge what was going on in the world, and thinking about who we are as English educators and also as teacher educators, we felt the need to also address our own healing in this process. And so that was one of the kind of goals of the piece too, to think about, like, how do we support one another as English educators and teacher educators, and then how do we also support other educators out there. And so to do that, it naturally flowed that we got together on, I believe that was a Saturday afternoon, morning, all day situation in Dr. Baker Bell's basement. And, we began healing among ourselves, just kind of being honest about like how we felt about what was going on. And, we were literally writing on the wall and, just reflecting and trying to make sense of what was going on at the time. And how could we use our skills and expertise in English education to do something meaningful. And so we had to heal among ourselves. And I just wanted to, so the piece was written from a place of love and justice and healing and commitment to support others.
Yeah. If I can just add one thing to it, the other part, and maybe we're going to get to this, but one of the things that you all asked, you asked us about was the writing process. And the one thing that I want to highlight here is that we really relied on the voices, community voices around what's happening with racial violence. We really wanted this piece to be something very different that wasn't just like that we're having this conversation within academia. And to be honest with you, at that time, this conversation was not being taken up in academia in the ways that we were beginning to think about. So one of the things that we did was we cited a lot of community voices here. We relied on the spaces that people of color and allies and activists were going to find out what was really happening in the world. So we know that when we were cutting on mainstream media, you know, how those narratives and stories were being told was different than the way in which the communities would talk about it. And so for us, before we got to the article, when we were trying to find out what was happening, you know, in certain communities, we had to go to Twitter and follow certain hashtags, you know, to get to what's really happening in those communities from the community's perspective. And so in writing this piece, we really wanted it to represent how communities of color and allies are going to find out what's really happening. And so we wanted to make sure that we upheld those voices in this piece. And so even if you look at the citations, many of them are non-academic, you know, citations. There were blogs that we looked at to help us understand, you know, the patterns of racial violence that's happening in the media that we went to and said, yeah, this is right, right? And these are the type of things we know have been happening for some time. And so that's what you will see reflected in this piece.
And really quickly, before we move forward, bringing it sort of back full circle, I just wanted to mention that in addition to the communities of color citations, we also had conversations around what our elders and our ancestors thought of this work. And so that's where the Malcolm X and the Bell Hooks citations came from, because as Black women scholars, we understand and we understood fully that, you know, there were some things happening back then that are very well connected to what's going on now in the struggle with Black and brown communities. And so we wanted to sort of have all voices of all generations represented in the work.
Mm-hmm.